The image of witches being dragged from their homes, tried in shadowy courts, and burned at the stake is one that has haunted the popular imagination for centuries. These grim episodes are not the stuff of fairy tales, but a deeply disturbing chapter in human history. The witch hunts that swept across Europe during the medieval and early modern periods reveal a dark side to justice a side, driven not by truth, as evidence or fairness, but by fear, superstition, and social tension. The reality of the witch hunts is not only unsettling because of the cruelty involved, but also because of what it says about how societies treat the marginalized, especially when gripped by collective panic. Medieval Europe was a world of uncertainty. Disease, famine, war, and death were constants. Life was precarious, and people craved answers for their suffering. When the crops failed or a child died suddenly, explanations were often sought in the supernatural. God was believed to be omnipotent, but so too were the devil and his minions. Magic, in particular, sat in an uncomfortable space between the divine and the diabolical. People had always believed in folk healers, wise women, and those who could speak to spirits. For a long time, these figures were simply part of rural life. It wasn't until the church and secular authorities began to equate such practices with heresy and devil worship that witchcraft became criminal. The earliest cases of witch persecution were sporadic and inconsistent. In the early medieval period, the church was actually skeptical of claims about witches. The famous Canon Episcopi, a text from around the 10th century, insisted that many alleged witches were simply deluded, their powers imaginary. But this stance would not last forever. As the authority of the church expanded and its doctrines grew more rigid, the line between superstition and heresy began to blur. Magic was no longer just a misguided peasant tradition. It was a tool of Satan. And if witches were Satan's servants, then they were enemies of the Christian order and had to be destroyed. By the late Middle Ages, particularly around the 14th and 15th centuries, witch hunts began to intensify. The bubonic plague had swept through Europe, killing millions. Communities reeling from this devastation looked for scapegoats. Women who lived alone, those with unusual knowledge of herbs, midwives who were blamed when a child died during childbirth, these people became targets. The stereotype of the witch, as an old wrinkled woman with a cat in a cauldron, didn't emerge by accident. And many of those accused were elderly women, often poor, widowed, or otherwise socially isolated. They were easy to blame, and easier still to condemn. One of the most infamous turning points came with the publication of a book called the Malleus Maleficarum, The Hammer of Witches, in 1487, written by two German inquisitors, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger. This manual laid out in chilling detail how to identify, interrogate, and prosecute witches. The book became a sort of how-to guide for witch hunters, legitimizing their methods and spreading fear across the continent. It was a bestseller in its day, and its influence lingered for centuries. The trials themselves were horrifying affairs. Accusations often began with a neighbor's suspicion, a whispered rumor, or a dream interpreted as evidence. Once accused, the suspect, usually a woman, was subjected to interrogation, often involving torture. In many cases, people confessed simply to end the unbearable pain. These confessions were then used to implicate others, triggering a chain reaction of arrests. Some trials ended in prison sentences or exile, but many led to execution, usually by hanging or burning. Torture was not only common, it was institutionalized. Devices like the thumbscrew, the rack, or sleep deprivation were used to extract confessions. It was believed that witches could resist pain through magical means, so the brutality was often extreme. Even the legal systems that claimed to offer justice became tools of terror. Trials were based on hearsay, coerced testimony, and outright superstition. Defense was rarely allowed, and innocence was nearly impossible to prove. One of the cruelest aspects of the witch hunts was the way they turned communities against themselves. Friends, neighbors, even family members were encouraged to denounce each other. The pressure to conform to religious orthodoxy was immense, and fear of being accused oneself often led people to participate in the persecution of others. Trust eroded. Villages became theaters of paranoia. The line between accuser and accused could vanish overnight. While the most notorious hunts occurred in the early modern period, particularly in places like Germany, Switzerland, and Scotland, the seeds were planted in the medieval world. These were societies built on rigid hierarchies and powerful institutions. The church wielded immense influence, and the idea that evil could take human form was deeply rooted. Witchcraft became a catch-all charge for deviance, defiance, and misfortune. It allowed those in power to control the narrative of suffering. If a village was starving, it was not the result of poor harvest planning or land mismanagement, it was the work of a witch. It is important to recognize the gendered nature of these persecutions. Although men were occasionally accused, the vast majority of victims were women. Misogyny ran deep in medieval culture. Women were seen as morally weaker, more susceptible to temptation, and more likely to consort with dark forces. The witch trials became a mechanism for reinforcing patriarchal order, punishing women who did not conform to societal expectations. A woman who spoke too boldly, who refused marriage, who knew too much about medicine or nature, she was dangerous. She was a witch. By the time the witch craze reached its peak in the 16th and 17th centuries, tens of thousands of people had been tried and executed. The phenomenon spread beyond Europe to colonial America, where the infamous Salem witch trials echoed the same blend of fear, religious fervor, and injustice. Eventually, skepticism grew. Legal reforms began to challenge the validity of witch trials. Enlightenment thinkers criticized the lack of rational evidence and the cruelty of the procedures. Slowly, the hysteria waned, but the damage had been done. The legacy of the witch hunts is not confined to the past. They serve as a haunting reminder of what happens when societies abandon reason in favor of fear. When justice is warped by ideology, and when those in power use scapegoating to maintain control. The very term witch hunt has become a metaphor for all forms of mass hysteria, moral panic, and institutional abuse. Yet beneath the historical horror lies another tragedy, the silencing of countless lives. The voices of the accused, the condemned, and the forgotten are almost entirely lost to time. They left behind few records, often only fragments of forced confessions or trial documents written by their persecutors. But they were real people. They had names, families, memories, and dreams. They were not the villains of their time, they were its victims. Remembering the witch hunts is not just an exercise in historical curiosity, it is an ethical imperative. It teaches us to question the machinery of justice, to scrutinize the claims of authority, and to recognize the humanity of those society casts out. It asks us to look beyond the simplistic tales of good and evil and confront the uncomfortable truth that some of the darkest crimes are committed in the name of righteousness. In the end, the witch hunts of the medieval and early modern periods are a mirror held up to civilization's face. They reflect not only a belief in magic, but also a deeper fear of the other, a fear that still lives within modern societies. Whenever we hear stories of people demonized for their beliefs, punished for their differences, or judged without evidence, we are hearing echoes of those old cries from the stake. It is easy to believe that we have moved past such brutality, but history reminds us otherwise. The same mechanisms of scapegoating, paranoia, and persecution continue to exist in different forms. Whether it is directed at religious minorities, political dissenters, or marginalized groups, the spirit of the witch hunt can resurface when fear outweighs reason. To understand the darkest part of medieval justice is to understand something timeless about the human condition. We are all susceptible to fear. We all seek explanations for suffering. And we are all capable, under certain conditions, of doing great harm, while believing we are doing good. The true lesson of the witch hunts is not that people once believed in witches. It is that they believed so fiercely they were willing to kill for it. And that, more than anything, is what we must never forget. Thank you for joining us on this haunting journey through one of the darkest chapters of human history. The witch hunts were more than just superstition or fear of the unknown. They were a brutal reflection of what happens when fear drowns out reason, when justice becomes a weapon, and when societies turn against their own. These tragic stories remind us how easily a community can slip into hysteria, and how devastating the consequences can be for those who are different, misunderstood, or simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. If this episode stirred something in you, it's because the echoes of these injustices are still with us today. It is not just about history, it's about how we treat each other now. So, before we point fingers or judge others without understanding, let's remember those who were silenced by suspicion and burned by fear. If you found this video thought-provoking, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing it with others. Let's keep exploring the truth behind the legends, and never stop questioning the stories we inherit. Until next time, stay curious, stay kind, and remember that real justice always begins with empathy.